Hello guys, welcome to JD Bots. In this video, we'll be seeing how to insert rows into the database using the Power Automate tool. And the data which will be coming from the API response. Yes, this is the URL and here is the response from the API. This contains an array, that is trivia categories. Inside an array we have many objects. Each object has an ID and name. We'll be creating a database with a column ID and name, and we would be inserting each and every data to our database. Okay, let's get started. So I hope you have logged into Power Automate tool, and before that we have to create our database, right? So I'll create a database and we'll be creating SQL database. Let's give the name as SampleDB. We select the server. If you have already created server, then you need to select it over here. If you have not created one, create new server, provide the server name, the admin login and password. Fine. After you have created the server, configure the database. The default selection would be standard. I'll be using basic one because I don't want to get charged more, because this is just for the demonstration purpose. I'll be having the size of 100 MB and create our server and the database. Server, if you have not created earlier, it will create the server and database. Since my server is already created, it is now creating my database. There can be multiple databases in single server. It will take a while. Okay, our database is successfully created. Let's go to the query editor and let's write some queries. If you can see, there is no table present as of now. Let's create a table, and I would name this table as category. And the first column is ID and the data type is integer. Let's keep this as primary key, and the second column name was name. Since name is a keyword, so I'll be enclosing inside brackets, and it is of data type varchar. Let's keep it as 50 because there are some category names which have the long names like Japanese, anime and manga. And I would say that this should not be null. I should not keep any null values inside this column. Okay, we'll be creating an empty table. We'll be feeding the data from the Power Automate tool. Let's run this query and refresh our database, and let's check if our table is appeared under the tables. So category table is there with two columns, ID and name. both are not null. ID is the primary key. Okay, now move on to the Power Automate tool. Click My Flows, create a new flow, and it should be instanced flow because I'll be triggering it manually. I'll give the flow name as insert categories in DB. And how would you like to trigger this flow? By manually. Now this is our trigger. Now the action part. The first step is calling this API. I'll copy the URL and I'll write the action as HTTP. The method is get method because I want to get the data, and URI we have put, and that's it. Since there is no authentication assigned to this API, so we don't have to write anything over here. HTTP's part is done. Let's initialize some variables. I'll rename this because it's a good habit to rename, because once you're creating a complex flows, then it's really hard to debug, or it's really hard to find it out at what place the error is. We can easily find out at what place, but it will be a good practice if you know what that particular action does. I'll write this as HTTP, call the API, call the category API. Fine. Before initializing the variable, we have to parse the JSON, because the response which we will be getting is in the form of JSON. See here, this is a JSON response. Okay, before initializing, let's delete this part and let's run only both the steps. Okay, save this flow and let's test as of now. Flow ran successfully, and the output status code is 200. That's a successful output. And here is the body. The body contains our response. It contains an array, trivia categories. Inside an arrays we have several objects. Okay, let's copy this whole body. We would be needing it to create a schema that we'll see in the next step. Let's edit this and add a new step, parse JSON. And the content is the body. See, it shows the dynamic content. It shows the output from the previous step. Previous step output had body, headers and status code. Status code was 200 and the JSON response is in body. So here is the content. You can manually write the schema. If you don't know how to write, you can generate from the sample. We'll generate it. We had copied the JSON response and we'll be generating the schema. So it has generated schema for us. It tells us what are all the data types. The first one was object, and second one is array. Array is this one. This is a trivia categories. This is of the type arrays, and the item contains the objects. Inside each object we have an integer. This was the ID, and we have string, which was name. Now let's initialize some variables and store this data. We have the action as initialize variable. I'll write this as, let's use the same name, trivia categories. We'll get confused if we use the same name because the dynamic content shows the same name. So let's use only the categories, and it is of data type array. We are creating a variable with name categories of type array. This is the step we are doing right now, and the initial value is trivia categories. See, the dynamic content shows the output from the previous action, that is the parsed JSON. Inside parsed JSON, either you can provide the body, item, ID, name, trivia categories. So I'll be using trivia categories since that is an array and I'm storing in categories. And let's rename this one. Initialize variable categories. Let's rename this one as well. API response. Now, next step, we'll be initializing the ID variable and name variable. Let's name it as ID. And it's of type integer. I think if you don't want to get confused, I'll name this as ID var. Let's rename this initialize variable ID. We'll again initialize name var, which is of type string, and let's rename this one. Now we have created a variable categories of type array. We have created a variable ID of type integer, and we have created a variable of name and of type string. Next is we have to create a variable of type object. I'll tell you why we are creating the object type. And initialize variable, and I'll give this as item. Why I'm giving it as item? Because these are all individual items. It's just the name I'm giving. The item will contain all the objects, individual objects. Inside objects we have both the variables, and the type is object. Let's rename this one. I think till now it is fine with you all. Now we will iterate through each object. First of all, we have to iterate through categories. As you have seen, we have initialized categories with trivia categories. Now our next step is control. Inside control we have applied to each. It's a for loop. And the output from previous step will be using categories. Under variables we'll be using categories because categories is initialized with trivia categories. And let's now set the variable. And the variable we'll be setting is item. So inside categories we are setting this object into this variable item, and the value is, if you scroll at the last, this is the output from applied to each current item. Our for loop will be iterating through this array. For each object it will set the variable item, so the item value will be changing for each iteration. Now till here I think it is fine. Let's run this one first, and I'll show you what is the output of item variable. Let's see the past JSON one, where we have initialized the trivia categories to the variable categories. So this is the whole array which got initialized to categories, and we are iterating through this array. And let's see the output inside apply to each. When we open the set variable, the first object was ID name. This gets saved into variable item. This was the first object. If you go to the next iteration, there is a second object, and so on. There are total 24 objects, and each time the item value is changing. Let's edit and continue. Oh, I forgot to show you something. Let's go back and see the last successful run. So the value is in JSON. Now the value of item is in JSON format. So can we use again pass and get the value of ID and name? Yes, we can. So I'll again use parse method. Let's just rename this one set variable item, and this parse JSON item, and the content is the item, and the schema is, we can generate the schema, we can copy the JSON from here and paste it over here. So it generated a schema for us, and the next step Let's set the variable ID with value from the previous action. Previous action is pass JSON item. Inside pass JSON item, we see the dynamic content as body, ID and name. Body will contain both the values, ID and name. So we select the ID. Remember, for each iteration the ID value gets changed, and for each iteration the ID variable value will also change. Set variable ID. Let's set our name variable with the value name. Let's rename this as well. Now all our content and data is ready. Now the final step to insert the row. Let's use the connector SQL Server. Inside SQL Server we have so many options, and we'll be using insert row. For the first time users, if you are using this connector for the first time, you need to create a new connection. For creating the connection, you have to click on this top right triple dot and add a new connection. Select the Azure AD because we are using the Azure DB and sign in. Select the server name. There seems to be some connection issue, but yeah, this is the process. You have to select the server name, database name and the table name. I'll use my already created connection and I'll select the server name, database name and the table name. Table name is category we had created. Once you select the table, it will show the columns, and the ID should be the ID variable which we have already set in the previous action, and the name is name variable which we already set in the previous two actions. Perfectly fine. This is our whole flow. Let's save and run. Before that, let me show you by running the select query to see the data. Currently there are no rows available. Let's run this one. I'll perform the trigger action because we are using the manual trigger. We need to sign it to the SQL Server. Continue. Run flow. Your flow is running. These all steps got completed, and this is on the final step. Flow ran successfully. Let's see the output. The table name is category, and for the first iteration ID is 9 and the name is general knowledge. Let's check out our database. Rerun this query. I think there seems to be some issue. Let me refresh our database. Select top 1000 rows and run the query. Wait a second. Oh, so the problem is the data went to the JDBots DB. This is my another DB because I had created a connection with this DB. I have not created a connection for the sample DB. Let's check that DB whether that DB is updated or not. We have the table category, select top 1000 rows, and voila, here we have all the data. I think this is the fastest and easiest way to feed the database from any API. Okay, I hope you find this useful. Thank you all.